It is 7 p.m. in Washington and 2 a.m. in Cairo. This is Press TV's World News. Well, the U.S. has warned the Egyptian government and protesters to avoid violence as the protests against President Hosni Mubarak escalate.
There's an obligation by the government not to engage in violence. There's an obligation by those that are protesting not to engage in violence by burning government buildings.
Robert Gibbs says Washington thinks the Egyptian government is stable. He added that the protests in Egypt are an opportunity for Mubarak and his government to show a willingness to listen to the Egyptian people. Gibbs also called Mubarak a close and important partner of the U.S. He declined to comment on the challenges to the Egyptian president's decades-long rule. An Israeli minister says Egyptian government forces will have to exercise force to control the protests in Egypt. Israeli media have also quoted the minister as saying the government of President Hosni Mubarak is rooted in the military and other forces. The Israeli official says Tel Aviv expects Cairo to weather the protests and remain in power. Israeli media have not revealed the name of the minister. Israeli officials have said Tel Aviv is closely watching the situation in Egypt. Well, in Egypt, eyewitnesses say the army is taking up positions ahead of protests expected after the Muslim Friday prayers. The country's largest opposition group has predicted a, quote, exploding situation on Friday. The Muslim Brotherhood has called on Egyptians to demonstrate after the weekly communal prayers. This as authorities have said no protests will be allowed. Meanwhile, clashes between police and anti-government protesters continue despite a violent crackdown on demonstrators. Days of unrest have claimed at least 9 lives so far. Authorities have arrested up to 1,000 activists. Opposition groups have promised to stay on the streets until the decades-long rule of President Hosni Mubarak comes to an end. Egyptian opposition leader Mohammed al-Baradei has arrived in Cairo against the backdrop of escalating anti-government protests.
I have said a number of times that the right for peaceful demonstration is an absolute right of every Egyptian, of every human being. I wish that we didn't have to go to the street to impress on the regime that they need to change. We tried signatures, we tried boycotting the election, nothing worked. The regime, every demand fell on deaf ear.
Al-Baradei pledged to join opposition protests. He also called on the government to give a political response to demonstrations. He said a security response would lead to consequences nobody would like to foresee. Anti-government protests are expected to escalate on Friday when millions gather at mosques for prayers. Well, for the latest on the Egypt uprising and analysis on that, we're now joined by Edward+peck, who is a former U.S. ambassador, joining us via satellite from Washington. Mr. Peck, as always, thank you for joining our broadcast. Now, Netanyahu's government believes Mubarak will survive this unrest by having to exercise force, power in the street. It says Mubarak's well-rooted in the military and security apparatus. Is this true?
Well, we're going to find out, I suppose, but I think it's fairly typical of the Israeli government to urge the use of force, which of course is what Israel does whenever it faces anyone who is unhappy with the situation in occupied territories, for example. They get pretty violent there. You remember not too long ago when Arabs living in Israel, Israeli Arabs, demonstrated, and a fairly large number of them were brutally killed, which is how the Israeli government believes it should be done. I'm not sure I agree with that, that approach, but it's certainly what they do.
Right now, sir, though the U.S. has spoken for democracy, it isn't standing by protesters by ending aid to security forces now killing Egyptians. Why is that?
Well, because the relationship is supposed to transcend what could be a minor bump on the road to the sorts of things that the American government would like to see. When you have an assistance relationship with another country, any relationship between two countries where one country is giving something to another country, you definitely have to give them what they want or not give them anything at all, because you can't give them things that they don't want. So our relationship has been largely based on support for the government to be able to maintain its borders and protect itself. And some of that, of course, spills over into what we would call maintaining order, police, that sort of thing. And so that is a typical relationship. And it looks as if in a country such as Egypt, the military aspect of the government has grown pretty strong, perhaps too strong. And I'm afraid, I'm very concerned that we might see a great deal of violence tomorrow, which an awful lot of people expect and some people want. And I think that that could be bad for everybody in the area, especially in the short run.
Right now, Egypt is, of course, a powerhouse in the region with its citizens spread far and wide within the Middle East. How then will countries with large populations of Egyptian expatriates react if Mubarak's government collapses?
Now that is a very pertinent question. I remember back in the days of Saddam Hussein and Iraq, where there were lots of Egyptians that went to Iraq for the purposes of helping to build the economy. And I remember what happened when the Palestinians, who also had lots of expatriates working in other parts of the Arab world. There is sometimes a tendency on the part of the governments where expatriates are in large numbers to perceive a possible security threat from those people. I don't know how realistic that appearance of a threat is, but I think it's rational to expect governments that face that internal problem will be watching carefully to see what it is they need to do to maintain stability and security in their own countries. And that could affect Egyptian expatriates.
Right now, 2011 has begun on a tense-filled note for Arab dictatorships. How lasting, if at all, will demands by people for freedom and rights that the U.S. was never able to push for successfully be in the long term?
Well, the United States seems to have a tendency to believe that other people should do things the way we do, even if those other people don't necessarily see it the same way. If I were in charge of the American government, which is highly unlikely, but if I were in charge, I would be very careful as to what I said in commenting about this kind of a problem in another country, especially when it's a serious problem, especially when it's a potentially serious problem, not just for the country itself, but for the region. And speaking too much on the subject when it is not directly our problem, we haven't caused it, we're not going to control it, we'd be better off not saying much, certainly much less than we're saying now, as everybody has to tell the Egyptians, both the government and the people, what they should do and what they shouldn't do. It is not really our affair.
All right, we'll have to leave it there for now. That was Edward Peck, former U.S. ambassador, joining us via satellite from Washington. Mr. Peck, as always, we appreciate your insight here at Press TV. Well, Tunisia's interim premier says a key